Hello and welcome to another BAPT webinar. It's the last of this series before the BAPT 2020 conference, which is in Milton Keynes, coming up in early April, and we're looking forward to that. Angelina Bennett, who is joining us today, is one of the presenters at the conference this year, and is going to be presenting on, I believe, a similar topic to what we're going to be discussing tonight. So it's really great to have her here. She's a past president of the BAPT, the British Association for Psychological Type. So she knows an awful lot about our organisation, and it's great to have her here to talk about conflict between psychological types. So hi, Angelina.
Hello.
Hi there. How are you doing today?
I'm fine, thank you. Busy day.
And so just give a bit of background about yourself. Be interested to find out sort of a little bit about your career to date and when you actually just came across psychological type for the first time. When was that?
Okay, so I went to do a degree in psychology in my early 20s on recommendation of one of my evening class teachers. She sort of said, "You have a natural knack towards psychology, why don't you go and do that?" So I sort of said, "Oh, okay," because I didn't have any other better ideas, and got to really like it. And then I think, like most people who've trained in psychology, I was really interested in clinical psychology to start with, and spent some time working in the health service, both as a psychology assistant and also a healthcare worker in learning disabilities and acute mental health, which was all really interesting and good fun. But during that time, I came across the idea of occupational psychology. Some of the other girls I worked with went and qualified in it. And it was very different to what I thought. I always thought it would be a very rigid profession that was all about just testing people and boxing them and numbering them and things like that. And you know, they came back and said, "Oh no, it's nothing like that at all. It's much more interesting." So I decided to do that training. And then luckily my first job was with OPP, now known as the Myers-Briggs Company. And interestingly, in the whole of my psych training, which was only a year, actually, the master's, type wasn't mentioned. We looked at Belbin, we looked at trait tools, we on the undergrad degree we learned about, you know, Eysenck and Freud, but nothing about Jung. So it was a completely new thing for me, really. And I just think I was really lucky to have that as my first job, because obviously OPP and Myers-Briggs Company were very steeped in MBTI and training it, and got to learn it really, really well. And it gave me the privilege, really, of qualifying people to use type through the training programs, and having, you know, I don't know, maybe like 50, 60 people a month go past my eyes that I knew the types of and could watch for a few days during the training. So in a way, it was like having a type laboratory in front of me. And we also used to observe the practice sessions. So at the end of people's qualification, they would have to practice on someone and give feedback. So I also got to witness countless examples and stories of people talking about their type. So I just feel like it was a really lucky position to be in, to learn about type really well from a live and observational way, not from reading.
That's really interesting. Yes, like you're saying, it's the way to really understand type is to see it lived out in real people. So what do you think that gave you that really clarifies that type is a real phenomena in the world, and that other people might be missing who potentially would dismiss it as not even being a thing?
Yeah, it's interesting because people always say, you know, what's the validation evidence? How do you know it's real? And you know, tend to want numbers on it, as you would with some other models. And there are numbers. There are, you know, you could predict this many ISTJs will be drawn to a certain profession, and lo and behold, they are. So you've got those sorts of validation things. But I say to people, just go home and watch, look at it. You'll see it play out. Or even during the training, it would be, okay, do you know people who are on these two different sides? What goes on between them? So I think it's something that is validated by real life experience and watching, much more than it is by statistics, which you can do it by statistics. But I just think, compared to, you know, trait theories where, you know, we know people who behave in different ways and things, but traits aren't that consistent. There's a ballpark, but you move around. Whereas types, no matter what type you are and how consistent your behavior might be with that type, or how extreme your behavior might be on that type, just having that dichotomy, you see the differences play out.
And it's even in specific situations, right? You know, let's say if you're a person with a thinking preference married to a person with a feeling preference, you know, you might manage to get along pretty well overall, but you know that types, you know, when you get to those, as we'll talk about tonight, those conflict situations don't seem to have a resolution. It's like you've taken different positions that kind of entrench themselves in one way of approaching something or seeing the world, and the other person takes another, and we get that splitting of perception or value on things.
Yeah. So it's interesting you use the word entrenching as well, because, you know, a misunderstanding or conflict could start off purely as a thinking feeling difference. Someone values something, and something that someone else doesn't think is the most important thing about it, or literally just the way something's said is interpreted as hostile or offensive, and then that's where the entrenchy bit comes in, because once you're in a conflict situation, it's easy to become defensive, and the more defensive we get, the more entrenched and stuck in our position we get, and the more one-sided we are, and the less chance there ever is of getting out of this, because, you know, by then the blinkers are on and the cuffs are up, and that's where you are. And that links into the developmental level stuff, whatever developmental level, however psychologically mature, or however well you use your type, or how emotionally intelligent you are. Once something triggers that defensiveness, you sort of drop right back down into being rigid and fixed in your perception. I mean perception in the normal sense of the word.
Yeah. So that, yeah, like you said, this defensiveness that really entrenches us into whatever one-sidedness in a sort of typological polarity that we might be in. And there's various typological polarities, I guess, that we see repeatedly coming up in life and relationships and so on. When you're working, are you still working with this sort of MBTI four pairs approach, or are you working predominantly with an 8-function approach, and therefore sort of pairs of the 8 functions?
Yeah, it's interesting. I tend to see things in terms of whole types. So, you know, an INTJ compared to an ENFP, or, you know, a whole type pattern. So I'm always I've always got that idea of, you know, what are the type dynamics, what's on show, what isn't on show, what's driving the car, as in the dominant function, where's the predominant energy. So I see it all as a package. However, I during my time working with type, I've been through various peaks and troughs, where, you know, I got to a point of thinking whole type and putting it all together and seeing it as the functions, as you say, was so important, and it was so diluted by having 4 dichotomies, that I started to use type with people in team events and things in a way that was just too complicated. And I've had to come back to the point of, actually, there's a lot to be gained from literally looking at one preference pair, one dichotomy. and really not underestimating the value of using type in that way. And I think I've spoken about it a couple of times at the conferences as well, that there's different levels at which you can use type. And I mean, T and F, I mean, you could spend a week on that, couldn't you, really, just on its own, without even mentioning the extroverted and introverted forms. So, yeah.
Yeah, so yeah, like you said, there's a lot of depth that you can go into even on just one little aspect of type. So how does he think that kind of gets restricted by the amount of time we actually have in practice to work with people on this kind of thing?
Yeah, I mean, as an independent type practitioner, quite often I was invited in to do, the one session, can you come and do us type, and trying to get that point across, that getting to your 4-letter code is the beginning. That's not the thing. That's not the end of the process. That's the very start of the process. And then you work with it. So, we need maybe 2, 3, 4 sessions, and then maybe revisit it again in a year's time. It's a really hard thing to persuade a client of. Quite frankly, I think they're just thinking of trying to sell on extra stuff, whereas really you're trying to make the most of the investment they've already made. So I think that has a big impact in what you can do with type. So, you do tend to work at the 4 dichotomies. People get their types. Maybe you plot out the team, do a couple of application exercises. And then, 2 months later, people are saying, I was a FP something. So.
So if you had an ideal situation to then take it forward to make the most of it, like what would you think will be the best route to that?
I personally think if a team wants to work with type, and it could be the board of directors or an intact team, or even if it's being embedded into an organization, I think to have sort of sessions every couple of months at least, where even if it's just half a day where you catch up, maybe do a different application, find out what people have observed themselves. I mean, one of the really nicest projects I ever worked on was a high potential leadership development program that ran over 18 months. And we saw the people every 2 months, I think, but then they had a couple of days of teaching and some coaching. But we introduced type right at the beginning, and it became the language as we went through the course. So by the end of it, people, I mean, we didn't get into anything heavy like shadow sides or anything like that, but just having it as the language and the backdrop, and them observing their working life and interactions through type, and being able to come back to the coaching and use that language. You knew that they were really getting the most out of having done that theory at the beginning of their program.
So a framework of language that you can then flesh out with real stuff over a period of time, real life examples and lived stuff.
Yeah, and you tend to start off with type in a positive way, of like, oh, this is your type, and these are the gifts of your type, and all this stuff, and tiny little pitfalls. But as the 18 months went through, they really did begin to see the trappings that their type can get them into, and the downfalls and the blind spots and things that they had no value for, that they realized was important after all. I mean, myself as an INTJ, used to think that knowledge and logic was everything, and proof was everything, and typical INTJ stuff. And it's taken me a long time to realize the importance of relationships, the importance of having a nice network, the people aspects generally.
Yeah, we're talking about like big lifelong development stuff, aren't we? It's not just a 2-hour workshop.
No, and in fact, that can sometimes make people worse. I mean, one of the things that inspired the work I did about the development levels was we used to do 3-day qualifying training or 4-day qualifying training, and people would turn up all, you know, pleasant and normal on the first day, and then you sort of put them through the 4 dichotomies. By the end of the day, they were getting their type and thinking about it, and, you know, somewhere halfway through day 2, all those types would become massively exaggerated. And you know, people would be like misbehaving and saying, oh well, I'm sorry, I think I need some time out, I'm an introvert, I need to think about this, or you're going too fast, or sorry, we need to talk because we're you know, you just think, oh come on now. So everything would become exaggerated for a while, and then it would resettle again and straighten itself out. But there's always this peak, and I find sometimes when you work with organizations, if you've done type a little bit quickly, or it's been an introduction, it can have that same effect where you're leaving people in a slightly exaggerated state or using type as an excuse. Yeah, I just think that's a bit of a joke. And I think I did it as well when I first found out I was an INTJ. I thought, oh, excellent, an excuse to be, you know, whatever, bad-mannered, I guess. Whatever INTJs do that isn't so good. So I'm just wary of you being in front of me, Richard, and being an INTJ yourself.
Well, that's true, isn't it? Well, it's interesting to have two INTJs speaking together. You know, we hopefully would be on the same page.
Yeah, you know what I mean.
Yeah, I know what you mean. So the issues that you were just talking about with how practitioners might see issues coming up in the way type is presented in workshops and things, that potentially then causes the sort of problems that then put type in a bad light or give it disreputable kind of impression to other people. Is there any other examples you can think of that? You know, the way when type kind of goes wrong and people, it doesn't come out in the way it's intended, in the way people use it.
I do remember going to do a team event once where the boss was introducing it the day, and he said to his team, oh, you know, you'll really enjoy this. I went through it myself a few years ago, and, you know, I found out I was really judgmental and I had no idea before that. And I was like, oh no, you know, because he was a judging type, and for some reason that's what he'd taken away from it. I was okay with it as well. But, you know, he put that there as the introduction. I thought, okay, there's a lot of work to do now restoring this. There's other times when I've had a few things kick up sometimes during the JP exercise. You know, I finish my work before I play, and I play anytime. It's quite a standard exercise where if something is missed out in the explanation or the setup or in the way somebody says something, there can be the perception that one side's really uptight and the other side's really lazy. And I've had that happen once, where it was one particularly vocal person sort of took it and ran with it and derailed the whole thing. So yeah, it can happen. It has to be quite carefully handled sometimes.
Yeah, the understanding of the concepts and not being misled by the names or the words that sound like something else.
Yeah. One other thing that we're quite keen on when I'm doing the type training is if people are quite often, particularly with type dynamics, I might say to someone, an easy way to remember this is to put the name of somebody you know next to each function. So, for example, if extroverted feeling is a real description of someone you know, put their name down there. But always make sure you're picking people you like and you respect and you think are really good, to avoid you stereotyping certain types.
Yeah, you get a negative impression of certain functions or types.
Yeah, and you do hear people say that about, you know, this certain type is negative, and you have to sort of get right.
Well, that brings us nicely into the subject of conflict between type, which I think ultimately is a big part of what Jung was getting into with the phenomenon of type and what it is and how you recognize it, is bring that qualitative attitude towards certain ways of seeing the world that are not necessarily your own preferences. We really know we're a type because there's something that just seems wrong to us. So how have you now sort of seen the conflict side coming through in the research you've been doing recently, in the studying you've been doing?
I don't know if I call it research or stuff. It's just based on just long years of observation and things like that. And it is interesting what you say about Jung, because he did start off calling it the problem of type. It wasn't like, oh, we've got these types, aren't they lovely? It was there's a problem, and he did see it as a limit, a bias, a pair of blinkers. What was your question, Richard?
So the idea of conflict, how do you see that occurring in terms of people's attitudes towards other ways of being or doing things?
Yeah, it's interesting because there's so much talk these days about diversity. And we're all doing diversity training and unconscious bias training. But there's very little about diversity of character. And I do see biases still existing in certain places about certain types. And I mean, much of it's personal, because and that's what the conflict work that I've been doing is about. You can't help who you are, and we will all have certain types that rub us up the wrong way, or that we perceive negatively, or we just don't get what they're about. They're complete mystery and bewilderment to us. And it's not always going to be the way. It's not every time you meet someone who's your opposing function or inferior function or whatever that there's going to be a problem. But general patterns. So when I did the writing, there was a big caveat thing at the beginning that this is very dependent on who you are, the relationship you have, how developed people are, the situations that occur. Because I mean, some of the people I get on best with are my absolute opposites.
Yeah, so it's
that I really admire.
Doesn't always mean, and that's the problem with type. You can't predict, that people will have a problem or not. But if you knew more information, such as whether they're developed, balanced, extremely polarized and one-sided, a particular way, it might be a clue as to, are these people likely to clash?
Yeah, I mean, a lot of people say to me, what type gets on with what type, and I said that there's a few sort of known possible hotspots, which is in the conflict stuff. Possibles, but really I think the biggest factor is how open-minded, accepting, maybe developed you are yourself, not defensive and non-judgmental.
Would you like to show your slides? I know you had some specifics we could look at with this in terms of conflicts.
Okay, so I'm going to be talking about this. Where's it gone? In the conference. There was quite a lot of it, so I'm just going to talk about a couple of bits of it in the conference. Is that on, Richard?
Yeah, it is now.
Yeah. So I was looking at type and conflict. This was a series of blogs I wrote recently that are on my website and on the Type Pro website. Just looking at all the different possibilities, and you see there I put the potential for conflict, because it's not a given that this is going to happen, it's just how it might happen. So the first one was literally perceptions of conflict, that mainly from the thinking feeling perspective, that that people with a feeling preference will sense conflict much earlier in a process than someone with a thinking preference. So there's a lot more sensitivity to there being a difference of opinion, a lack of harmony, people not being on the same page. All that starts to feel uncomfortable for most feeling types. I say most as well, because it's not everybody. Whereas thinking types, most of them can have a good ding dong, as we say, with someone, a good debate, and everything, a big difference of opinion can be quite fun. But there's no personal intent usually, so it doesn't feel like a conflict until it gets shouty or hostile or personal. So that was the first article there, was just looking at that, even that difference in how we perceive something to be a conflict. Then there was the conflict handling styles, how the different types might respond to conflict, and that was based on the Damien Killen and Danica Murphy book about how they might resolve conflict. And then it went through each preference. So you all know this, how particularly J's conflict with P's and vice versa, and sensing can conflict with intuition. And when I say conflict, it doesn't always have to be offense or disagreement or whatever. Like for sensing and intuition, sometimes it's literally misunderstanding or going away from someone who speaks that opposite language to you, thinking they don't know what they're talking about, or they missed the point of what I asked them or what I wanted to know. So it can result in more of a mistrusting of the other person, or a judging of them as I don't know, maybe being a bit incompetent because they didn't answer the question in the way you wanted them to. So so it's not always conflict in a hostile way. And then the ones that I've got some slides on here are the opposing function, which is one's dominant function done in the opposite world. So for example, introverted intuition versus extroverted intuition. And I think that's an interesting one, because I don't think it's one that a lot of people become aware of until they've been using type for a while, or unless they've maybe looked at some of the 8 function models. It's not that obvious. So you'll hear people say, oh, you're an N and I'm an N, excellent, we'll be on the same page. And yes, there will be some similarities in certain ways, but the potential for getting on each other's nerves is pretty huge as well.
Yeah, it's very interesting. Like Jung said, that the same function of opposite attitudes were incessantly at war, as he put it. There's a real difference between, say, introverted and extroverted thinking, which they're not just happy to tease together, or getting along. There's very different intent and type of logic behind those two types of thinking, for instance.
Yeah, exactly. So I'll put some of the. Should I show some of the slides for that? And then the other was inferior function and developmental level. So inferior functions, an interesting one. So this is one of the slides here for the opposing function, and they're pretty blunt, so nobody gets offended. But and you must remember, this is only the potential for and how sometimes people can see others when, usually when they've been a bit annoyed with them anyway. So introverted sensors can sometimes see extroverted sensing as being really reckless, mischievous, disruptive, dangerous, don't think of the consequences, really quite, worryingly risky people. And likewise, extroverted sensors can see introverted sensors as being just really cautious, a bit rigid, sticklers, a bit stuck in their ways, so they take what's the positive of those types and see it in the, see the very negative of it. And the other one, intuition, introverted intuitives can often see extroverted intuitives as just like talking irrelevant stuff, having really scattered ideas, and wasting airtime by talking about things that are never going to happen. Whereas extroverted intuition sees people like me, which was news to me, as really stubborn and closed-minded, because they'll say, hey, why didn't you try this? Why didn't you try that? And I'm there with my little visionary idea going, no, it doesn't fit. Shush. Not going to happen. Which which is very stubborn and closed-minded. They have a point and they have a point, but that's not the intention. It's just like, no, it doesn't fit. Shush. So and then on the judging functions, this is one you alluded to, the introverted thinkers can sometimes see extroverted thinking as, pick your mistake and make it. You're taking action too quickly, you just want to get something done. impatient and a bit forceful. And extroverted thinking, quite frankly, sees introverted thinking as just like really slow and indecisive and procrastinating. And why haven't you done this yet? You know, what have you been doing with your time? So there's a big potential for, I see this one a lot when I'm coaching groups and teams. It's a really common misperception between the two types. And then finally, the feeling. This is an interesting one. That introverted feelers can often get irritated by extroverted feelers. You know, when they come in helping people and doing things and remembering somebody's birthday, they just roll their eyes and go, "Oh God, look at them trying to make themselves popular again," because it's just such a different expression of feeling. And likewise, extroverted feelers can occasionally see introverted feelers as being a bit self-absorbed, because it is about, well, this doesn't feel right for me. I don't think I'm comfortable in this situation. And they'd be like, well, what about everybody else? You're making everyone else feel awkward. Join in. So they're just very, very different expressions of a function. There will be some similarities in them. When we're working at the single dichotomy level, we will talk about, you know, the feeling function and bring out sides of both. But digging a bit deeper, you do see these potential for perceptions that aren't so great. Yeah,
it's a really good point. Like you said, these are not often that clear when people first look at type on a full dichotomy kind of level.
Yeah. I actually I had a friend who was INFJ and his brother was INFP, and they'd had a lifetime falling out about how they'd handled a particular situation, because, you know, the INFP didn't want to be there, it was too uncomfortable, and exited the situation. And the INFJ wanted to be there and repair it and stayed and suffered. And so they were both like guided by that feeling function, but in very, very different ways, that they didn't understand each other. And they had fallings out about it until they realized this. And they're all friends again now. Yeah.
So what other examples can you give from your own learning about yourself as well?
On this particular one with the opposing function, or just generally?
Yeah, with this one, for instance, yeah.
As I said before, I'm on the introverted intuition side, and I don't know how much emotional intelligence I actually have these days, but I used to have really not very much, and just be very blunt in my responses to people as well. So if someone said, "Oh, why don't you do this?" I'd be like, "No, it's not going to happen." So really coming across as stubborn and close-minded, and it's quite interesting, because somebody who doesn't know me very well recently said to me, "Oh, I quite like the way you see everything in like really simple black and white terms, and you know, it's either this or it's this, and then it's done." I was really like mortified, thinking, "Oh my God, is that how I come across?" Because my I guess everything's like gone through the introverted intuition complications and gets spat out by the extroverted thinking quick decision. Nah, not going to happen. So I think it has that extra introversion thing that people don't know what you're thinking, which is always a problem.
Yeah, and it's also, you know, the thing that introversion in Jung's terms is about subjective process. You know, it's about what is going on for you internally, and therefore it doesn't matter what the rest of the world thinks or intuits. Or, you know, it's actually the most reliable thing to an introvert is their internal knowing or experience, or what function it is.
Yeah, so you know, so for as an introverted intuitive, I would have this sort of idea of, you know, a inner vision or a model, or how everything fits together, or how I'm seeing this working, which I don't tell other people about, not because it's secretive, just because A, they'll be bored, and B, it's really it's really hard to do. So when somebody comes along with something else that they want to add into that, I've had to learn to say, okay, tell me a bit more about that. Okay, that might be able to fit with this, and then just take some time to explain a little bit more where I'm thinking, rather than just saying, nah, it's not going to happen. Yeah.
So now, I guess we're talking about the development. Like you said before, it depends about development level. If we're more one-sided, how does it look then when we go through this process of development?
Okay, I'm just going to move us down to there. So, so people who know and have heard me talk about things know that ego development's of interest to me and how it ties in with type. But generally, I've got here on the slide the 2 early stages of development, and you don't get many adults there in this bottom box. Well, I'm not saying, you might recognise some that you know of, but it's where you got very black and white thinking. Everything's very confrontational. There's a need to win, very defensive people. Now, we might not live here, but it's somewhere where we could go if we get into a conflict with someone. We could drop into this box very quickly. So, your most evolved person in the world, if you're trying to park the car and someone suddenly cuts in front of you and nicks your parking space, I'm sure you don't go, oh, fiddle-dee-dee, let me just go and find somewhere else. There'll be a bit of dropping into this box, even if it's just for a few minutes. So when you're in that position, it's very, very easy to get into conflict and very difficult to get a good resolution to conflict, because the defensiveness and the need to win and the very one-sided viewpoint is very strong. So luckily not many adults live in that box. The stage above it is where as an age stage, it's sort of late childhood to teenage, but again, it's somewhere we can go when we're in groups, when we get into cliques and groups and, different departments at work, and even like the MBTI fans versus the 5-factor model fans. We all have little cliques that we can fall into quite easily, that we might end up taking these in-group, out-group views. And again, it can cloud our objectivity to really listen to the other side or view them as having something interesting to say or worthwhile to say. Is that making sense, Richard?
Yeah, definitely. So what would you say the order in these 4 boxes is in terms of, is there a linear kind of progression of development?
Oh, sorry, it's in 2 layers, so that the bottom bit is, why is it in 2 bits? I'm just trying to remember now. The bottom bit is like, the first box is like the description of how their brains are working, almost how they're thinking, what their perspective is. And then the second box next to it is how they might behave in a conflict situation.
Okay.
So it's a table that goes across.
Mm-hmm.
And then the later stages, again, the average stages here are where most people are. So it is starting to get an idea that there are different ways of looking at things, and how open you are to do that. And when you get to the middle box there, the higher of the average stages, it really is starting to think about, to have that awareness that you don't have all the answers, and even if someone's got a different opinion, it might be worth listening to and bringing in. So yeah, I mean, there's a lot of writing on these slides. They're from the conflict blog that I wrote, but just that general idea that it's about dropping the defensiveness and opening your perspectives to admit that you might not always be right, or to hear what someone else is saying, or to right down to really getting into the shoes of somebody else and saying, I can completely see where you're coming from on this, and not just saying it, but really, really seeing it. So.
What's the egocentric perspective? I can see there is an asterisk. I'm interested in what the note might be on that.
Why is there an asterisk there? Maybe it's because it's text speak and I'd like to explain it somewhere underneath. I think because people use the word egocentric in various different ways, and here it's meant to mean, it's that stage of life where a lot of people will relate everything to how they've experienced it. So, you know, you might be telling them a problem you've had, and they'll say, oh yes, that happened to me, so this will happen and this will happen and this is what you need to do. So no understanding that you're actually a different person, you might experience it differently or need to deal with it differently. So maybe that's why the asterisk is there. I'd have to go back to the original blog to find out what that means. Yeah.
I see what you're saying. Yeah. So it's, you know, there's different ways people might just define that.
Yeah.
So would you say, for instance, with these development levels, that people might be at different levels on different sort of typological dimensions? For instance, the thing which is their auxiliary and tertiary functions, they may be potentially at a higher level of development of being able to negotiate between those opposites, rather than, for instance, their dominant and inferior functions.
It is possible. So any type can be at any level. There are some theories, mainly coming from the emotional intelligence field, that, you know, certain types might be more developed in, for example, their cognitive perception to deal with complexity and different viewpoints and things like that, than others, and others might be more developed in their ability to have emotional intelligence in terms of awareness of others than others. But, you know, it's sort of, it's theoretical at the moment. It's not really developed, but there are definitely different strands that run through this. And one of the issues with these development levels is trying to pin a flat level on someone and say, you know, Richard, I think you're at level X, because there will be I think there'll be different aspects. You know, it could be your emotional intelligence is there, but the cognitive isn't. Probably the other way around, as an ITJ would be theoretically more likely. So yeah, there's different strands that run through it that could be developed at different sides, and some of them may be related to the auxiliary and the tertiary. And also in terms of Jung's development, type development, or at least Isabel Meyer's interpretation of it, good type development is about getting that balance right between how you're using your auxiliary and your dominant together. So, you know, you've got a nice balance of taking information and then making decisions with it, instead of one rushing ahead of the other or getting stuck.
I know that when I interviewed Steve Myers last year, who wrote his book about Jung's individuation and how it differs from the Myers-Briggs take on type development. He's more from down the line of looking at the opposites, being able to transcend the opposites within type on a greater level, rather than just trying to have a complementary kind of helpful use of the auxiliary. You know, it's about really going through a transcendent process of actually, like you've put here, you know, being able to hold the multiple perspectives and really going to a stage where the functions stop to be almost separate. There becomes a transcendent thing, which is neither one nor the other, but it's something.
Yeah. In the book I wrote, where I've got the sort of whole 7 levels, I think that the top the top version of each level is almost that type. It's still there, because with it comes a huge degree of authenticity and genuineness, and it's almost like, you know, you need a personality and a character to be authentic. So there's hints of it there, but yeah, as you say, there's a lot more. It's not so much like you're holding opposites or even holding the tension of opposites. It's like that transcendent thing where it's both and then it becomes something else. I have no idea. I'm nowhere near it. I only know it theoretically.
Well, that's my question, is that, you know, have we ever met people who really get to that point, and what are they like?
Oh, I don't know. I could do with meeting some more. But you do hear stories of people who, you know, humility is a big indicator at those more advanced levels. You know, they'll say you could tell they were really wise and really humble, and they were a great listener, and when they spoke to you, you felt like you were the most important person on earth because they gave you their full attention. And then when they did come out with something, it just seemed to smooth everything and answer everything. And I think those people are the people we're talking about here. Yeah, I have to say, I don't think I've met many, but
well, it's a great aspiration for us to have, and I think it's a great. We have to wrap it up now, unfortunately, to reach the end of the webinar. But it's really great to see type in a developmental context, you know, to show that it's not some fixed and rigid box system. You know, it's
not at all.
Like you said, it's a dynamic system.
Yeah.
But I love the fact what you're saying that, you know, there's always a hint of something there, because it's kind of authentic to have for our identity to have a preference, even if it's such a tiny preference that it doesn't cause ruptures and conflict.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's often how we know what our type is because I often say to people, like, you know, when you're doing extroversion, introversion, I'm like, I don't know, I can't tell. I'm like, well, it's obviously not a problem for you then, so don't worry too much about it. Let's move on, because yeah, I find that people are much more able to identify it when they're like, oh yeah, I do that. So yeah.
Yeah, it's great. Well, I'd love to continue this another time. Hopefully we'll get back for a follow-up webinar. We really look forward to hearing your talk and more about the conflicts at the conference in April. If anyone else is watching who's keen to come along, there are still some places available, so you can go to bapt.org.uk and register for the conference. And we'll see you there. And thank you very much for joining us.
Thanks, Richard. Thanks for inviting me. Thank you, everybody.
Take care. Bye-bye.